Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On the DL. We have a guest coming in from the UK today, Ben M. Freeman. I'm saying M because I've been told by Ben that there are, quote, a million Jewish Ben Freemans. So it's Ben M. Freeman. Hi, Ben.
Hi, how you doing? And that's true. There are literally a million.
1 million. I mean,
1 million.
how many Jewish people are there in the world? And 1 million of them
Yeah.
are Ben Freemans, right?
1/16.
Exactly. Good math, Ben. Are you coming in from London or from Scotland? Where are you today?
So I'm in London. I'm from Scotland, but I've lived in
I,
London for the last year and a half.
how's that?
It's good. It's an adjustment. I previously lived in Hong Kong, which is a very specific experience, and it's very specific to be Jewish there. So London, in many ways, is an adjustment, but it's still okay for the moment.
I'm very excited to be connecting with you. I've been following you for a while. You are, I must admit to you, you are one of my go-tos every single day, whether it's good news or bad news. I feel very centered by
Thank you.
you. So I want to thank you. Thank you for connecting and agreeing to connect and to talk to me about so many things that we're going to talk about today. But I want to tell our listeners and viewers who you are, if that's okay. I'm going to read a little blurb on you. Feel free to add to it after if you'd like. Okay, so Ben M. Freeman is the founder of the modern Jewish Pride movement and the author of the Jewish Pride Manifesto, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, and your second book, Jewish Pride, Reclaiming Our Story. That's available now, correct? Both are available? Okay, that's great. Ben has been inspired by his experiences with the LGBTQ pride community. Ben aims to educate, inspire, and empower Jewish people to reject the shame of anti-Semitism imposed on Jews by the non-Jewish world, as well as non-Jewish perceptions of what it means to be a Jew. Ben is one of his generation's leading Jewish thinkers and voices against anti-Semitism. And I have to say, and I hate to say this, wow, you've been really busy since October 7th.
Yeah, it's a really strange situation for your professional life to become busier and for there to be more to do amidst this type of tragedy. And I think it's also complicated because I'm a Jew. I'm just like every other Jew in the world watching what happened on October 7th and responding and reeling and trying to cope. So it can be a tricky thing to be a voice of empowerment and inspiration and pride during a time like this. And although I really believe that pride is specifically important now, it's hard. I mean, this is a really difficult time in Jewish history, and it's unprecedented in our lives as Jews. You know, our specific generation. This is the first time we've experienced something like this, so that's an enormous challenge.
I heard you talking about how Jewish people in North America are we've been feeling anti-Semitism for the last couple of years. I'm going to say a couple of years. I don't want to get too dramatic here because I'm going to talk about personally my experience, my lifetime. But Jewish people around the world, particularly in Europe, look at North American Jews and say, we've been living with this our whole lives. Maybe
Yeah.
it's been peaking, climbing in the last couple of years. But it's so relative, don't you find?
Yes, and I
Like
think that
it's just become our experiences.
yes, and I really think it's important.
Say that again.
I really think it's important to be empathetic to kind of all Jewish experiences. And I think, there is a reason that the vast majority of my work is in North America. And I think it's because of this period of, say, waking up to the current situation or the reality of Jew hatred. But, when I critique the North American Jewish experience, I'm doing it with empathy because I understand. We have to understand the kind of global experience. And from a historical perspective, like the longue durée, right? This vast expanse of time that we as Jews are part of. So, yes, of course, we have our specific experiences, our specific contexts, but Jews in North America, Jews in the United States specifically, are still a part of the wider Jewish experience and have responded to that i.e., meaning, a kind of desperate need to integrate and to assimilate in order to circumvent Jew hatred, and a kind of desperate need to have made it. And I think, when we critique that, when we talk about it, especially as Jews living in Britain, and I think even more so for the mainland Europeans, I think even they have a slightly different experience to the British, but we have to be empathetic. There is a tendency to be like, where have you been? We told you so. It's like, yes, we were
Mm.
talking, but people get to where they get at the speed which is appropriate to their circumstances. And saying to an American Jew or even a Canadian Jew 15 years ago, by the way, X, Y, or Z will happen, I think people would have not believed. They would not have thought it was real. And it's taken the actualization of those ideas, the experience, the lived experience to kind of wake people up.
Now, I I want to talk about the idea behind assimilation and what Jewish people have been experiencing for the last 20, 25 years. And when you talk about trying to deal with Jew hatred and why particularly North Americans have assimilated, but I do think that there is, whether there's been a cultural shift or not,
Mm.
um, there is a there is something that binds us together, whether it's our traditions or culture, in whatever continent we're in.
Yeah.
And you can say that about any other religion or culture. I only can speak of my own Jewish experience. And I will tell you that from my lens, when I've been in Europe and I have been asked to a Jewish home for Shabbos, I am blown away by I am blown away by how similar
Yeah.
I feel, as if I'm sitting at my own family table with people I may have just met either that day or that trip. And I feel like we're all one big family with the same experience, except for how much anti-Semitism we have lived with in our lives.
Mm.
I'm going to give you an example. I was in London this past June, sitting at a beautiful Shabbos table, absolutely blown away, beautiful experience, beautiful family. And their sister and her husband live in Germany. They came in with their three children. They were visiting London, and they were telling us about how their home was spray painted with swastikas when they had gone to Israel for Passover. Everybody knows that they are the Jews on the block.
Mm.
And she wants to leave. She said she wants to leave and move to Israel. And her husband was like, absolutely not. She's been begging him for years. He said, absolutely not. Our lives are here. Our money is here. Our business is here. Very, very successful family. And he said, he will not do it. He will not give in to this. And I thought, my God, if I walked anywhere in Toronto that there was a swastika anywhere, or someone had vandalized a quote Jewish store or bakery or grocery store, I would be shocked. And now my lens has changed.
Of course. Of course, and that makes total sense because you're only exposed to what you're exposed to. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a kind of a sliding scale of perceived acceptance. It's not even acceptance, it's perceived acceptance. And I think the Euro some of the Europeans, the mainlanders, never really felt accepted. The British certainly felt more accepted than them, and then the Americans, I think the Canadians felt more accepted than us. But absolutely, I mean, the conversation about how long we have left in Europe has been a conversation for years. There was an article published in the Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg or Jeremy, I think Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief in 2014, and it was titled "Should Jews Leave Europe?" I mean, this is a
Mm-hmm.
conversation that has been going for a really long time, and we've been dealing with Jew hatred in a more overt way. Although I will say, though, when I was at university, I was really exposed to left-wing anti-Zionism. But at that time, I'm 37. I was 37 the other day. So
Happy birthday.
I was, excuse me, 19 years ago. And we didn't actually then have the language. Maybe the academics did, but the general population didn't really have the language of anti-Zionism. I knew that what was happening was wrong and it hurt me and it was offensive, but I couldn't have kind of verbalized it and explained where it fit into this wider context. And now we know, right? Now we know that post-Holocaust anti-Zionism is a form of Jew hatred, etc. But yeah, listen, I think that it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that any Jew has to have those conversations. And I think the difficulty is for us as Jews. And that conversation you recalled kind of illuminates it. It's very difficult to know when to leave. We look at the Germans in the 30s and, there are sometimes questions asked, why didn't they leave? I think it's a really difficult thing to pick up your life and move to a different country, even if it's Israel. We have Israel, they didn't, of course. But I think that's a really difficult thing. But I think that more Jews across the world are having those conversations.
We're having those conversations,
Yeah, me
and
too.
it scares the shit out of me. I speak to my mother, who is 79 years old, and she said, never in your lifetime, my lifetime, did I think that we would be having these conversations.
No.
And it pains her. I mean, she's towards the end of her life. I'm in the middle of my life. I have my children. And I've talked about it with my children. They think it's bananas. They
Yeah.
think it's a crazy conversation to have. But I want to go back for a second, because there's so much I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about your experience as a gay man in Scotland, and how somehow that formed, or you birthed into this beautiful advocacy and activism from that, and where that landed you today. So tell me, let's go back a little bit and tell me how that started for you.
So I was born in Glasgow, and it's the biggest city in Scotland. And I was born I lived in an area called Newton Mearns, which is where a lot of the Jews live. It's like there was 5,000 Jews in the countries, but five Jewish families lived on my street. So it was a very Jewish area. We all lived basically in the same locale. And it's kind of interesting because I have two experiences running simultaneously, particularly from when I was a teenager. Before I was a teenager, I wasn't necessarily aware of my sexuality, so it kind of was not really an issue. But my Jewish life was ticking, and I really had a very full Jewish life. Went to the only Jewish school in the country, in elementary school. My best friends were Jewish. It was very Jewish. And then I became a tween, I guess, became like, 11, 12. And I went to a non-Jewish high school because there was no Jewish high school. And that was the first time I kind of experienced Jew hatred or anti-Semitism. But I was always aware that we were different. And I think that is one of the reasons I have such confidence in my Jewishness, is because I feel totally comfortable with the idea that Jews are distinct. Now, when I'm saying we're distinct, I don't mean we're completely unique. I mean that amongst every other group, we are also there as specific. So the French are specific, the Arabs are specific, the Chinese are specific, the Canadians are, and so are the Jews. We have our own culture, our own traditions, our own calendar, our own language, etc. And I always understood that because my non-Jewish friends would go out and party on a Friday and I'd be at home doing Shabbat with my family. So it was very real and kind of tangible, right? And then I started to consider my sexual orientation. And I've spoken very openly about this because I don't feel shame any longer. But at the time, I felt enormous shame. I didn't want to be gay. It was not something I felt at all comfortable with. And you've got to remember, so as I said, I'm 37. I was born in 1987, so in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. And I think that colored the kind of societal perspective on the gay experience. So when I was coming out or starting to think about my sexuality in maybe 2000, 2001, that wasn't that long ago, right? The AIDS epidemic was not that far away. So I was filled with huge amounts of shame. And ultimately, I really hated myself. I was filled with complete self-loathing. And I then, in that experience, realized something. And this realization was not the end of this experience, rather, it was the beginning of a journey. And it was the realization that I had done nothing wrong. I'd fallen in love with a boy from my school who we had this kind of long, tortured, unrealized love affair because it was the time and we weren't able to kind of express our feelings. And it was pure and innocent, and we were like 15. We were like babies. So I knew that I had done nothing wrong, but I felt like I was being punished for a crime I hadn't committed. I felt like the world was punishing me through overt and societal homophobia. So as I said, that kind of started me on a journey. And for a while, it my sexual orientation took precedent over my Jewishness. I was kind of more concerned with dealing and coping with my sexuality and becoming comfortable with it. So my first partner, I've spoken about this. I mean, the first line of my second book talks about my ex-boyfriend, my first partner, who is a Jew hater. And I tolerated that because I was desperate to be in a relationship. I wanted so much to be in love and to be in a happy, inverted commas, relationship that I was willing to tolerate that. And that is shame. That was me kind of prioritizing my sexual orientation over my Jewishness. And it's not that one should come over either. It's about they have to be kind of an equilibrium because they both exist in me. And that wasn't me being true to myself. But as kind of I went on, I became more comfortable. I grew up, I matured, right? Times changed a little bit. And then, my Jewish journey had been kind of ticking along. I was a Holocaust educator. I started a nonprofit that worked with Holocaust education in Scotland. And, my father passed away in 2017. And I took an enormous step back from talking about the Holocaust, basically because I couldn't emotionally deal with it. And then, kind of coincidentally, when the Corbyn Jew hate crisis was ramping up in Britain, so let me just say, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party for about 5 years, and he is a racist. He's a Jew hater of the left-wing variety, and it was a very scary, very frightening time. And that kind of was picking up, that crisis was picking up. And at the same time, someone asked me to teach a class on the Holocaust in Hong Kong where I was living. They said, will you come and teach this class and teach this course? So I said, sure. So it kind of got me back into the world of this work. And then I was seeing the kind of modern manifestation of these ideas. I was speaking about it from a historical experience, but seeing Jew hatred in a modern way happening in the country of my birth. So I joined Twitter to take part in that conversation. And in that space, that's where I reflected and thought, Jewish people deserve a pride movement. Like, I have to say, like, pride is like the most obvious idea in the literal world. Like, it's not surprising or shocking or revolutionary or radical to say that Jews should like ourselves. We should be proud of ourselves. We should feel our Jewishness as a badge of honor and not shame. But certain trends post-Holocaust, specifically the notion of keeping our heads down, don't saying anything, don't rock the boat, that had kind of created this culture where Jews were not standing up for themselves. We were not owning our Jewishness and kind of wearing it loudly and proudly and wearing Magen Davids out of our clothes to show the world who we are. And not just as a form of resistance, to take pride in it because we love it. And that's where I felt, okay, we need this, we deserve it. And I felt, because of my own experience overcoming kind of internalized shame with regards to my sexuality, in a place to write about it. That's it.
Wow, that's quite the journey. That is quite a journey. And we need a Jewish pride movement.
Yeah,
we need it.
we deserve it.
We need it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
100%.
You talk about your experience, your gap year in Israel, that also fueled you quite a bit, your experience coming from Israel as well.
Yes, I mean, so I went to Israel when I was 17 and a half.
As did I.
Yeah.
Too. Mm-hmm.
And before I went, I'd grown up in Glasgow and is incredibly Zionist, and we kind of spoke about Israel as like the land of milk and honey. And the first day of my gap year, there was a garbage strike. And I was like, the land of milk and honey kind of smells. But at that time, I like fell in love with the land. I really, and I think this is the most interesting thing, or one of, not the most, a very interesting thing about Jews, that no matter where we live in the world, for the most part, it is a deep and emotional connection with the land of Israel. And I mean the land itself, like the dirt, and obviously the people who live there, but the geography, the terrain, the natural resources. And I just fell in love with it. And during that year, I learned a huge amount. I'd always been a nerd basically, and I love history. So I've always been like reading and trying to understand. And I was on a journey of trying to understand Israel and how I connect to it, and also how it exists distinct from me. Because there is this kind of weird situation that we have as diasporic Jews that I'm not Israeli. So I'm a Jew, I'm indigenous to the land of Israel, but I'm still not an Israeli. So there's aspects of Israeli culture which I don't understand, which may not seem obvious to me. And I do think
Mhm.
diasporic Jews have to have that humility when kind of thinking about Israel, because unless you make Aliyah and unless you make your life there, it's there's a tension in being diasporic. And then, I came back from the gap year and I was in Glasgow University, which was an anti-Jewish hellhole and cesspit, just like many college campuses are. But because of the experience I'd had in Israel, because of the knowledge I had gained, and I think more than anything, the confidence. I felt confident in standing up for Israel because I'd studied it, I believed in it, I'd seen it with my own two eyes. So yeah, I was just like, it was like fight or flight. And I fought every day of my gap year. And I don't think I'd have been able to do that I fought every day of my university career. And I don't think I'd have been able to do that if I hadn't spent that year in Israel.
And this, I love that you just said that because I felt the exact same way every time I came back from Israel. When I was in university, every summer I went and spent longer and longer periods of time there. I was convinced I was going to make Aliyah. I just thought this is where I'm going to be because I felt more at home there than I did anywhere else I had been in the world. It just seemed like the natural progression of my life as I was growing into myself and as an adult. That's where I thought I should be. And we grew up in a very Zionist family, very much so. And my sister was living there at the time, and I just thought this is it for me. But things changed, and but I will tell you, when I would come back every time from Israel, there was this sense of I am so proud
Mm.
of our people. I am so proud of our strength and of what we have overcome
Yeah.
and what we will continue to overcome. And this would fuel me and fill
Yeah.
me up with such pride. And as the years have gone on since I have been in those years of my life, I have lost so much of it. And
Mm.
it pains me to talk about it. It pains me so much. But I have to talk about it because I feel if I'm feeling it, there are other Jewish people,
Yeah.
particularly Jewish women, Jewish mothers who are feeling the same. And right now, at this point in history, I feel it is my duty to talk about this
Mm.
and say it out loud that if it's a shame that I need to center myself again and bring myself back to where I need to be as a Jewish person
Yeah.
because of what happened in October.
Yes. And I think, even the fact that we have to kind of celebrate Jewish resilience is kind of it's a sadness. Just like the fact that but it's something that I think that what we have to do is start understanding aspects of our experience which aren't normal. So the idea of
Mm,
having security outside our schools, yes, we need it, and obviously we're glad for it, but that is not normal and it's not something we should need. We should be able just to kind of live and express our Jewishness and to kind of understand our story without having to ever consider the non-Jewish world or how we relate to it. Like Jewish pride as a form of resistance. It shouldn't have to be a form of resistance. But I do think that one of the most important things that any Jew can do right now is understand Jewish history. Because that's something
mhm.
that I find to be miraculous. I'm writing my third book right now about
Oh,
the Jews as an indigenous people. And I'm, researching ancient Jewish history. And it's absolutely fascinating. And the most incredible thing that I see is the continuity. That, like, my name is Ben. That is a name which comes from the land of Israel. It's like understanding how it lives on in us, each of us around the world, whether we're Canadian, British, Australian, South African, French, Spanish, whatever, we are kind of a walking embodiment of not just our survival, because it's beyond that, but our continuity. And I think that is something which fills me with enormous amount of pride. And that's something I try to focus on because you're right, especially now, especially post October 7th, it's impossible. It's incredibly traumatic. And I actually think we're going to see kind of a real psychological impact around the time of the first anniversary. Because right now we're in fight
mm.
mode, we're defending ourselves, and maybe hopefully by that point our hostages will be returned, the war will be over, and maybe we'll have time to breathe. And I think at that point, we're going to kind of have to deal with our psychological response to this genocide which took place. But that's why Pride is so important, because it reminds Jewish people that we are more than what is done to us. We have an independent story that isn't only part of this experience of Jew hatred, although that is, of course, important.
So there's not that many of us around the world. We are a small international community. I've been saying this for months. It's not a lot of us. And that's why people who are not Jewish joke and say, why do people who are Jewish know everybody? Wherever they go, they play Jewish
Yeah.
geography and they can find somebody. But it's because there's not a lot of us.
No.
Um, I say we're many, but we're mighty,
Mm.
and we are resilient, and we will continue to fight. But and you say we are in a fight mode right now,
Yeah.
but it makes me very, 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 very angry.
Yeah.
It makes me very angry. And I'm not an angry person. I always start from a good place and start from a positive place. And I haven't been able to do that since October 7th at
Yeah.
all. For the first time, part of my Jewish pride is saying, no,
Yeah.
no, it's not okay. It's not okay that that you're staying silent. It's not okay that you have said X, Y, and Z on social media. It's not okay that you reposted something
Yeah.
that is such anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. No.
Yeah.
And that hurts me. You must be beyond. You must be beyond. I can't even imagine
I
the
think,
hate that you deal with.
yeah, I mean, I get a lot of abuse. And I have to say that
Mm-hmm.
actually, for the first time, it has worn me. Like before, you'd get periods of it and you'd mute it and you would kind of move on and you'd be aware of it, but it would pass. It has been continuous since October 7th or 8th, right through, and it does wear on you. But you mentioned two things which I think are really important. The first is anger. And actually, I think that anger is good. We should not be consumed by anger, right? We can't let it consume us and take over us. But feeling anger is important because it reminds us that we deserve better. And I
Mm-hmm.
will think back to a film that I saw, which changed my life actually. And it was the film Milk, about Harvey Milk, who was a Jewish man, but also the first openly gay elected official in America. And there's a scene where he is speaking to a crowd and he says, I know you're angry, I am angry. And it's always stuck with me. And I think that anger is okay as long as we use it to fuel us and it doesn't consume us. The second thing that I think that you've said is so important is no. And I would refer to that as boundaries. There are certain things we should discuss and there's certain things we should not discuss. People often ask me to debate, and I don't debate. I will explain, I'll educate, I'll discuss, but that's quite different from a debate. I'm not prepared to have a non-Jewish person define my experience or my identity. So actually, that no, and it can be a firm but gentle no, it can be respectful, it can be said with love, but still no is important. I've had real conversations with my non-Jewish friends and that have kind of laid down the boundaries in how we will talk about these issues. And I say two things to them. And the first thing I say, and some people may laugh, but it's, I know more than you about this. I tell my friends that because they're not Jewish and they haven't studied it. They've seen headlines and they're smart people, so they've done reading, but it's not the same as us living it. And the second thing I say is, I care more about you. This is my family, it's my home, it's my sense of security, my sense of self. So when we talk about it, you're going to have to make sure that you're being compassionate and respectful and understanding how it can be difficult for me sometimes. And I will make sure that I'm respectful in return. But I think those boundaries are crucial. We are allowed to say no. We're allowed to say, I'm sorry, that is unacceptable. I'm sorry, you cannot say that. And let me tell you why. And I will not debate with you. I will explain to you because we're talking about our life. And that anger, that's what I'm fueled by. Not just anger, there's many things, but the anger fuels me because really part of what I think is how dare you? How dare you speak to us like this? How dare you treat us like this? It is unacceptable. And this is why this is a part of pride. We know that it's unacceptable. We're not accepting it. We're not internalizing it. We're not saying, well, okay, that's just the Jewish reality. Oh, well, we're saying, no, this is the historic Jewish experience and it is unacceptable and we will fight back. And we're not just fighting back, in my opinion. to defeat Jew hatred. Because I actually don't think that's something we can do. That's really something the non-Jewish allies have to do. But we're fighting back to keep it at bay, number one, but also to reclaim our dignity and our humanity because we deserve better. We understand we deserve better. You understand it, Dana. You understand it when you are angry and when you say no. No, excuse me, I will tell you what it means to be a Jew. And that is really important that we have that confidence, that self-esteem, those boundaries, and we understand that what's happening is unacceptable.
Why? I don't know if you'll be able to answer this question. Why do they hate us so much?
There is an answer. There is an answer, and
Okay.
I can talk specifically about the West. And there are similar patterns which emerged in the Muslim world a little bit later, but seeing you're in Canada and I'm in London, we'll talk about the West. Pre-Jesus, I would not class the experience of the Jews as anti-Semitism. The Jews were treated in the same way that lots of other groups were treated by empires, right? That's when Israel, our land, our indigenous land, was colonized by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, Greeks, Romans. I think I've got everyone. It did change after the advent of Christianity. And the first thing we have to remember is that the early Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew and Jesus died a Jew. But at some point with Paul, there was a parting of the ways. And this parting of the ways was really the beginning of the building of a distinct Christian identity. And that was obviously a process which took a long time, but that's when it started. And Paul had to kind of justify why he was telling people to be Christian and not Jewish, but they were worshiping Jesus, who was a Jew, and they were keeping the Torah. They call it the
Mm.
Old Testament. They didn't discard it. They kept it as part of their Bible. So he had to come up with some explanations. So he began defining Christian identity against Jews. So he said, the Jews keep kosher, we're not going to do that. The Jews have Sabbath on a Saturday, we're not going to do that. And the Jews circumcise, we're not going to do that. And this kind of started this trend of defining Christian non-Jewish identity against us. We became kind of a pillar for them to understand their world via. This developed into an idea, I think in about 400 Common Era, of adversos Judeos, and it was literally meaning against the Jews. So there was
Mm.
someone whose name I obviously can't remember right now in Constantinople who would accuse people of being Judaizers. And that was an insult. You're making things Jewish. You're bad. So it was this kind of like trend we were seeing. And then the Roman Empire, or rather around this time, the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. But you have a super uncomfortable and awkward situation because while they converted to Christianity in 380 CE, about 350 years earlier, they had murdered Jesus. So the Romans had murdered the man they now consider to be their Lord and God. So they had to find a new culprit. So they
Mm.
scapegoated us and they chose the Jews. And it started this process of continuing defining non-Jewish identity against Jews, but framing Jews as an evil force. If we could kill Jesus, who was good and pure and holy, then what else could we do? Well, we could exploit non-Jews via the economic libel, the idea that we're hungry for money and resources. We could kill children via blood libel. We are conspiring, we're a force, we're evil. It's almost kind of metaphysical. It's really looking at an idea called the Jew. And that's what they defined their identity against, this idea. The thing is, we're real Jews. So we were
Mm.
always on the receiving end of these ideas. And then essentially, these ideas just became deeply embedded in society. And even when the world and the Western world kind of became more secular, their foundations were still in this kind of Christian theological adversos Judeos, Jew hatred. And this is the reason it's so difficult to overcome because what we actually have to do and the world has to do is dig up, uh, you know, I guess metaphorically speaking, their civilization and weed out, take out, find all of the instances of Jew hatred and adversos Judaeus and these ideas. And it's this, I think it's essentially too much for them. I don't think it's possible to like upend an entire civilization. And that is
I
why,
know.
very importantly, and the last thing I will say on this is it's why Jew hatred always fits the zeitgeist. It is always evolving to fit the times in which it is expressed. So after the emancipation of the Jews, there was a huge evolution in Jew hatred, which was against emancipation. It said, no, you can't be emancipated, you can't assimilate because you're biologically different. That was pseudoscientific racism. In 1948, Israel is reborn as a Jewish state. So, of course, a new or a
Mm.
modern form of Jew hatred was born alongside it because it's always fitting the zeitgeist, because it's rooted in these very kind of historic ancient ideas. And that's it. I mean, that is how I would describe or I would explain why Jew hatred exists in
But
such a way.
why, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Um, why now are we seeing so much hatred from groups that have historically been our friends?
Yeah, that's a really good
Why?
it's a really good question. So
Specifically the LGBTQ community.
yeah,
Specifically.
yeah, and also the Black community. And I think
Correct.
it speaks to a trend that took place with regards to the wider world, but definitely had specific implications for us. Historically, and I'm talking about pre-World War II, even like 1950s, um, the left was kind of focused on a class struggle, right? Like the Soviet Union was about a workers' revolution, and they wanted an international revolution, and the worker would own the means of production. That's not really what the left is about now. The left is about
No.
oppression and the oppressed. And that idea came in during the period of decolonization when the European empires were kind of giving up or being forced to give up their colonies around the world. And it started this idea of colonized and colonizer or oppressed and oppressor. And that became the dominant idea in the new left. So that is what we saw. And in that, we saw these kind of new leftists. They were willing to do business with or to support people they would class as freedom fighters, people they would class as oppressed, even if they were like awful. So even if they oppressed women or oppressed gay people or oppressed their own people, if they were framed as being a freedom fighter, then that was all good. And we're seeing this with Hamas, right? People say, well, Hamas are freedom fighters and therefore people should support them. That that's the core of that idea. It has specific implications for Jews because the Arab states and the Soviet Union stole and reframed Zionism into a form of colonialism and white supremacy and imperialism. So they did that, and then the world was kind of focusing on this new idea of what it means to be a leftist. So they obviously were like, well, look at Israel. Because Israel is white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism. And now, of course, the last thing I will say is that you also can't divorce all of that from the 2000 years period that I described just a moment ago, right? Like those people were socialized into a situation where they would readily believe that Israel was this awful, evil state. And that's the thing we have to consider now. It's not that every person who's standing against Israel is like a real nasty racist, but they've been socialized probably in a number of ways through leftist ideals, but also just through the
Mhm.
world.
But it's been very confusing because you have, I mean, particularly you talk about Canadian politics and you think of left liberal politics, you never equate that with what
No.
we are seeing as this, what people call themselves the progressive left. The progressive left to me seems the most anti-Semitic uh, wing of any part of our community or our culture right now. I can't even think of, we think of progressiveness, we think of
Yeah.
liberal politics. We certainly don't think of right or conservative.
No.
But you ask a Jew in the land right now, anywhere, and they will say, I'm not liberal. I'm not left. I have progressive values,
Yes.
of course, but I'm leaning right. I have to lean that way. And it doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense. It's so confusing.
It is
It's
confusing.
confusing for people.
Yeah, it really is. And I actually said this to a friend the other day, and a non-Jewish friend, an ally. And I said to her, I know that I'm asking you to upend your whole worldview. Let's look at the UN as an example.
Oh my God.
Most people would say the UN is a good organization. They would
Oh my God.
they would find it hard to believe that UNRWA would do what it's doing. Like because they have been trained, socialized, and not even brainwashed. It's just the world view is that international aid is good, human rights are good, and that's what these organizations are said to represent. But that's what we're asking people to do. They have to really kind of like upend and dismantle their worldview to really understand what's happening. And I think the problem is a wider societal problem that the whole world is experiencing, which is populism. And people are being kind of either, we sometimes say people are being driven to the fringes or the fringes are coming into the center. Like either or, there has been a mainstreaming of extremist ideas, I think probably on both sides of the political spectrum. I will say that the right, particularly in North America, and I think even maybe in Europe, is still a more violent threat. However, that's not to say the left
I
isn't
don't,
a threat. But that's not to
I
say
don't
that
know, Ben.
no, I think it still is. I mean, I can't speak to Canada, but I think the latest statistics I heard was the right is
Yeah.
still a more violent threat. But that it's apples and oranges because the left is that doesn't mean the left isn't dangerous. The left controls there's a phrase I always say like I can't remember like the media, academia, society is generally leftist. So it's not it's about understanding the threat. And I do think that that makes the left, in my opinion, as dangerous and maybe even in some cases more dangerous because the violent extremism from the right exists. But what we're seeing is every single day, social media, universities, mainstream media, the newspapers be kind of parroting these ideas. And then you see it in a mainstream newspaper. Oh, The Guardian said this, so therefore it must be true. But again, we're asking people to kind of upend the whole worldview and to be like, actually, maybe that newspaper, maybe that aid organization isn't what I thought it was, and I need to be more critical. But that's hard for people, and it is
It is
confusing.
hard. And it's where your work comes in for sure.
Yeah,
That's why I'm so grateful listening to you speak and sharing your thoughts with so many people because it does matter, right? Every single conversation, every single tweet, every single post or interview matters. Particularly here in Canada, there's a rot in our university and
yeah,
in our media. And I can say that because I was a member of the media and I would always stick up for the media and say, no, it's not like that. There isn't an agenda. You don't understand. It's not like that. And now I can say, as somebody looking in, it is exactly like that.
yeah,
And it is very, very, very upsetting.
yeah,
And maybe the idea is around changing our views, maybe really changing the way we look at things. I mean, it's easy for me to say as a Jewish person, but someone who's not Jewish, even as an ally, I think
yeah,
would be very difficult for someone to say, I don't know if I could look at that differently.
yeah.
I don't know.
You have to have a huge amount of humility because you also have to say, oh, I was wrong. I was tricked. I was wrong. I didn't understand. And that's hard for people to say. But no, you're absolutely right. We have to kind of it's kind of a sense like it's deprogramming. Like everyone needs to be deprogrammed. We all need to kind of not be making these, not having these bias. And I guess you can even have a positive bias that someone would look at the UN and be like, no, I'm sure they're not doing that because they have a bias in favor of the United Nations. But we have to start being able to like look at the fact. But also the problem is the media doesn't report it, right? Like there was
No,
an attempted stabbing in London in Golders Green a couple of days ago. There was someone threw a grenade at the Israeli embassy in Stockholm yesterday.
saw that.
It doesn't get reported. So of course non-Jewish people don't know. Like this is the problem. It's really cyclical. They don't understand in a way for the most part. They have their worldview and then they're also not being exposed. I've said to people in the last year, in the last 5 years there has been a terrifying rise in Jew hatred, and now per capita, Jews are the most targeted minority in Canada, Britain, America. And the person looks at me and goes, "What?"
I know.
Which is maddening, but also like where were they meant to hear the information if the Telegraph or the is it the Daily Sun or whichever isn't reporting it? This is the problem. And that's
So
where go on.
I read a statistic that Jew hatred was up 1,753% since October 7th. 1,753%. How do you not report on that? How do you not know that that is happening?
Yeah.
I mean, that's insane to me. And the other thing was when you talk about how are people supposed to know, um, about a month, maybe about a month now, maybe more, um, people here in Canada know that there's a hostage issue. Okay, they know that something happened in Israel. It was quote called a terrorist attack. They're not really sure. There's tons of pro-Palestinian rallies up and down the main streets in many Canadian cities. They know things are happening, but they're not really paying attention to the
Yeah.
hostage situation, which to me is really feels the most critical at the moment. And so I knew I needed to speak with Rachel Goldberg Poland. I knew I needed to speak with her because I need to blast it out here. And people heard the interview or watched the interview and said, wow, like I didn't
Yeah.
know, I didn't realize it was
Yeah.
that's insane.
Yeah, they don't know. And it's because, again, the and this is the thing we have to understand about media or human rights organizations or the UN. They're made up by people who are making decisions. And the reality is, I think that regarding this, and I think this is a terrible reality, but regarding this, a lot of people see it as a political conflict. And it's
Mm.
not actually. This is really a conflict about Arab and Muslim Jew hatred. And I'm not saying that every Arab and Muslim hates Jews, but just as we will talk about Christian Jew hatred, we can also talk about Muslim Jew hatred. And that's really where the roots of this lie. This is not about land. These violent, barbaric attacks have been happening, committed by Arab Muslims against Jews before 48. You know, there was the Hebron massacre, the Hebron pogrom. And people frame it as a political conflict. So then a person in a news desk who doesn't understand, who doesn't know the Jewish experience or the background, is like, oh, well, like I get that is bad, but well, maybe there's a conflict, maybe there's two sides. And that's why we see all the time they make statements about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Like it's
Oh
all
yes.
mattering
They're
it, right?
balancing. It's all balanced. They're
They're
trying to
balancing.
balance it. Yeah, we have to
Yeah,
show both sides.
yeah.
There isn't I say that
No,
sometimes it's not about both sides.
no, it's
Sometimes
not.
it's not,
And it's
you know.
also like Hamas committed genocide against Israel and the Jews on the 7th of October. They have threatened to repeat that, and they're also committing war crimes against their own people while continuing to attack Israel, right? So they are, if anyone really cared about the Palestinians, they would be condemning Hamas from morning till night. Get these people out of there, get new leaders in, get the Palestinians support and empowerment. And actually, we're seeing Palestinians in Gaza protest
Yes,
Hamas
we're
because
starting. We're
not
seeing.
all of them want Hamas to be in power. But this is the problem. The people making the decisions don't understand. They want to be polite and nice. And actually, as you say, no, this is pretty black and white, actually.
And you speak to any Israeli right now, anybody living in Israel, whether born in Israel, living in Israel, going to Israel, they will say the exact same thing as what you just said. They
Yeah,
want peace. They want
of course.
their neighbors. They want Palestinians to feel safe and be free and not live under a terrorist regime
Yeah.
and to have the same freedoms as any other neighbor would. But that's a whole other political conversation. I
But,
feel
but
like
but one thing I will say, sorry to interrupt you, Gina,
um,
is one thing I will say is
no, of
that
course.
I think that and I actually think this is connected to pride and about confidence and boundaries. So when people talk to me about a two-state solution now, I'm very clear and I say, yes, in theory. In theory, I would love for there to be a sovereign, strong, independent Palestinian state sitting alongside Israel in peace.
Beautiful.
But we also have to live in reality. And right now, at this very moment, and maybe things will change, but at this very moment, that's an impossibility. And it's an impossibility because the leaders of the Palestinian people, and listen, we know that there's leaders in the Israeli government who are terrible. So we acknowledge that and understand
Of
that.
course.
But the totality of the Palestinian leadership, really, whether they're Hamas or Fatah, because all of our energy has been obviously focused on Hamas, but Fatah also is no joke. And Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation for his PhD was on Holocaust denial. But they not only are not
He is no joke.
he's no joke, and
No.
they're not recognizing our right to live in the land, but they're also not recognizing our right to live. And we are not, to quote Menachem Begin, Jews with trembling knees. We're not going to lay down our arms, allowing people to attack us. We have a responsibility and a duty to defend ourselves. And yes, we want to empower the Palestinians, but we also have to be honest. And I think when people talk about a two-state solution now, you have to, for me anyway, I have to caveat it with in theory, because actually, right now, I do not want a sovereign Palestinian nation led by Hamas to be waging war against Israel over and over again. And this is the problem with the ceasefire now, people. Yes, of course, ceasefire now, if certain preconditions are met, hostages are released, Hamas turns itself in, dismantles it. And of course, they're never going to do that. But we're allowed to
Never.
live. We're allowed to live. We're allowed to live free of this constant terror. Our children are allowed to grow up, or should be allowed to grow up in Israel without the constant threat of war. That is something that is imposed on us, and we are entitled to live without that and to live prosperous lives in peace. And that is being denied to us, just as it's being denied to the Palestinians, primarily by their own leadership.
I want to talk to you about one last thing that I think is important. We sort of touched on it, and the optimistic side of me, the positive person that I've tried to be, but I've heard other people speak about this, and it resonates and it hits me very deeply, which is the idea that Jews in the diaspora, Jews around the world that are not living in Israel, have come together
Hmm.
in a way that we haven't seen maybe ever.
Yeah.
In my lifetime, the connection that we feel amongst each other, this has brought us back to one place. Maybe that is Israel, but we are all focused on one thing, and
Yeah.
it has made us stronger together.
Yeah.
And I know that you came here, you were in North America
Mm.
in the fall after October 7th. And you saw the same. You saw
Yeah.
it. It's not just a feeling I have. I feel like wherever I go,
Yeah.
if there's somebody Jewish, and you do feel the connection, whether someone's wearing a kippah or a Jewish star or something, when there's somebody, it's just a feeling. I can't explain it unless you're Jewish. It's just a feeling, someone is Jewish. And there are random hugs from people,
Yeah. Yeah.
or smiles from people, starting conversation with random strangers. And there is a there's this beautiful bond taking place
Yeah.
right now in the
Yeah.
diaspora.
I think it's the whole Jewish world. I think we are
Mm,
feeling the diaspora, and I think it's centered on oneness. This idea of Am Echad, Lev Echad, one people, one heart. And it really is that. We are, all of us, Israel, the diaspora, we've come together and we're all fighting a war. Israel is fighting on a specific front, but we're fighting a war too. And it's at university, in media, on the streets, at work, on campus, all of these things. And we're all fighting for our right to live as Jews. And I agree with you. I was in New York the week after October 7th, and people would stop me on the street and say, Am Yisrael Chai. Literally yesterday on the subway in London, a woman saw that I was wearing my two Magen David necklaces, and she mouthed at me from the other side of the train, I like your necklace, and she took out hers, and then we went, Am Yisrael Chai. And it feels like a rallying call, and it is incredible. The thing that I'm most concerned about, though, and I want to speak directly to all of your amazing listeners, is that this is not a moment that we can let pass. We have
mm,
an opportunity. You said, Dana, we have an opportunity here. We have an unprecedented level of Jewish connectedness, of Zionism, of Jewish expression, of Jewish action. How many people were lighting their Chanukiah and putting them in the window and putting up mezuzot and wearing Magen David or Chai? And of course, we know that some people are not because maybe they're afraid, but that doesn't mean they're not proud. They're responding to physical safety. However, the thing that we have to ensure is at this moment, we capture it. And I feel like I'm about to break into Eminem, right? That's the beginning of Lose Yourself. Capture this moment and we don't allow it to pass, because that is a tragedy. And the leaders in our community will be responsible if that is the case. If this unity, if this Zionism, if this pride dissipates, then I will be completely devastated, because This is the way we should be. And it's not just as a form of resistance, although it is, of course, a form of resistance. It's because we, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, we're distinct. We are allowed to own and celebrate and live our distinctiveness. And we'll all do it in different ways. But even me, since October 7th, I have increased my Jewish action. I now light the Shabbat candles and I say Kiddush. I put up mezuzot. I wanted to lean into my Jewishness because it's grounding. When you're being gaslit, when there's a hurricane around you, we know exactly who we are. We're a people, we're a nation, we're indigenous to the land of Israel, and we are part of an ancient civilization that has existed for 3,500 years, and it is still living and it's still evolving. And that is what it means to be a Jew. And we have to make sure that we continue this feeling, continue these emotions. Don't rest on your laurels. Don't, think, oh, we're fine, so I can relax. It's not about just being vigilant. It's about understanding. The only reason that you and I are Jews in 2024 having this specific conversation is because we stand on the shoulders of Jews who have fought for our Jewishness. Whether they fought like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprisers or the Maccabees, or they fought through expression, through commitment, either way they fought, and now it's our responsibility. We have to fight, we have to keep this alive.
I'm so blown away by you, Ben. I could start crying. I cry on this podcast sometimes.
That's
I want
okay.
to tell it. I want to tell. It is okay, actually. I cry a lot since October 7th. I've cried in
Me
front of a
too.
lot of people. I do. I cry now quite a bit. Um, that you are a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, so people can also read. But I do want to, before I let you go, I want to read this excerpt from an article that you wrote. I believe it was November 23rd, after you returned from your North American trip. And I'm quoting parts of it here. And you said, I met Jews no longer willing to diminish their Jewishness in order to be accepted. They were no longer going to accept scraps. They refused to accept their identities as Jews being defined by a non-Jewish world, and they were all ready to defend Israel with all they had. The pride I felt in halls across North America inspired me. It gave me the strength to keep going. When I sometimes felt so tired, I could have wept. I was spurred on by the immense pride and love emanating from these Jewish communities towards Israel and indeed the global Jewish family.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. And there is a change. And that's why I was saying we have to capture it. And the giving has been remarkable. The putting hands in wallets and sending billions or millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel is so moving, and it isn't just a cheap, easy action. It means something. Every dollar, every resource. My friend dropped resources at an airport when resources were being taken to Israel from Toronto. Every single action was an expression of our Jewish pride and our Zionism and our love and our oneness. And it did. I mean, like I that it's funny, like you kind of forget what you write because you move on to the next. And I remember writing that, and it moves me because it's true. And we are a family, we are connected, and we're going through something. And we repeatedly go through awful events, but we are stronger. We love our Jewishness more than they hate us for it. And we are
Mhm.
part of something wonderful and special that is real and tangible and is there if we only grab it.
Amen. And let us never forget this as we continue to move forward. I am beyond grateful that I have connected with you, and I know I'm meeting you through this screen, but I hope that we do actually physically get to hug. And
Yeah,
um, you are
sure.
you're extraordinary. You're so special, and I feel like you are a gift to our global community. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for everything that you do, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. I
Wonderful
mean,
to meet you.
you too. I mean, I will just say, from my perspective, it's we're all doing what we can do, and everyone has a role to play. And this is mine, but everyone has a role to play. We can all contribute to this Jewish family, and that's what we have to do. But thank you for having me, and we definitely will meet and hug in March.
I hope so. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.